fight against imperialism is a sham and a fraud unless it is inseparably bound up with the fight against opportunism. There's quite a lot of quotations that I'm going to have to go through. I think though you're going to find them enjoyable. Most of them are taken from soldiers. They're the words of soldiers that were written down in letters or given in interviews with a number of different authors who chronicled the events of the Etaples uprising. Because of the number of quotations, I'm going to have to read the presentation out, but there'll be plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions. When I actually came to do it initially, Tom had given me a book about a month or so ago, and it's the book, The Etaples Mutiny. We've got one copy left today that somebody can have if they want it. You can get this fairly easily now. It's available on the internet. But I found it really fascinating because it told a side of the First World War that you just never hear, whether it's in school or even amongst comrades. It gives the story of a significant, serious uprising that took place behind the lines in the British Army. And the book actually really focuses on a guy called Etaples, who we'll mention during the presentation. It was my intention initially to follow the course of that book, but as I read it, I got more interested in the events around Etaples, and I went and had a wider read around about mutiny in the British Army. And whilst I was doing that, it kind of pulled me away a little bit from the story of that particular individual. So there's not as much in the presentation about him as there might otherwise have been. Despite that, he is a fascinating character, and despite all the criticism of this book, which is out there, and if you Google it, if you look it up on the internet, you'll see an awful lot of people trying to rubbish the book. But actually I will deal with some of that in the introductory part of the presentation, because I think it's important, and I don't think that criticism actually stands up to closer scrutiny. So yeah, without further ado, I'll start the presentation. Don't get too worried. The font is a bit thicker than it might otherwise have been. I was absolutely dread sitting and watching, and you look at some of these amount of papers, you think, my God, have they got to get through all of that? But the bad news is I haven't got to get through all of that. But hopefully the time will fly by. Okay, so the events at Etaples Base Camp in September 1917 don't sit comfortably alongside the fairy tale stories that we're presently being told on television in the dramas, nor do they lend much support to the fantasies that are spoon-fed to today's population, which in this country at least is largely ignorant of the horrors of war, despite the fact that we inflict an awful lot of this horror upon other people. Since the Tory government rebranded Veterans Day some years ago to Armed Forces Day, and the next one's fast approaching, we've suffered the inexorable rise of Help for Heroes and various other militaristic support organisations which pass themselves off as charities but are used by imperialism as cheerleaders for militarism and intervention. This year in particular, we've had numerous documentaries broadcast championing the defence of democracy in 1914 and the plucky courage of British men and women who went off to do their bit in France. All this propaganda is in stark contrast to the actual views of the men and women who suffered the horror of participating in that conflict. But now that the last of those awkward veterans, Harry Patch, some of you will remember him and he's passing away a few years ago, who incidentally was a pacifist and left-winger, now that he's died, the total whitewashing has become a formality. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has been immeasurably easier to carry out to completion the carefully constructed propaganda campaign for a complete rewriting of the major events that unfolded in the 20th century as a whole. And the focus at the present moment is quite clearly the events of the first great inter-imperialist World War, a carnival of murder, slaughter and human misery, and a hell on earth where the burden of human suffering was saddled squarely upon the shoulders of the working classes. If you're so inclined to sit through Dan Snow or some other TV historian, you'd be inclined to think that the Great War was a bloody but necessary inconvenience, interrupted by football hijinks at Christmas between warring troops. The significance of all this for workers today is this: the bourgeoisie is seeking to distract the workers' real grievances towards a failing capitalist system, a system which is in deep systemic crisis, and it wishes to direct these grievances towards all and every scapegoat that they can easily point a finger at, be it the benefit scroungers, immigrant workers, or the Russian and Chinese menace. And in so doing, they are preparing the acquiescence of the British working class for more wars of aggression. And in the final analysis, they're preparing our psyche for the eventual opening of a third inter-imperialist world war, and our ready response to the inevitable call to back our troops, do our duty, and fight for Queen and country. Well, comrades, as Phil has said, these meetings are a part of our preparations for the same coming conflict. It is with this in mind that the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, has set its members to work on exposing these myths. The party, with the support of the Stalin Society, has held this year a number of successful public meetings around the country on the topic of imperialism and war. And in addition to these meetings, there's further events like this one today, which are taking place to deal specifically with other aspects of the First World War. The millions of men who were mobilised by imperialism, and of particular interest for us today are those who were mobilised by British imperialism, were sent to the slaughterhouse of the First Inter-Imperialist World War, often as mere teenagers. The men that sent them were the bourgeois class, and they fought in France for the bourgeois class interests. They were working people, and they gained absolutely nothing from the mutual slaughter of one another. The purpose today is not to lay out any new revelatory material concerning the unfolding of the First World War or the uprising at Etaples. I've done no academic research of my own. All I can lay before you are the details of events which are now nearly 100 years old, details which for most of these 100 years have been covered up and obscured. Much of what is said about the Etaples uprising, and particularly the role of Private Percy Topless, is disputed. And it's not hard to see why. The British government never officially acknowledged that any mutiny had taken place until 1978. The sources available to us come largely from a number of books which were written since the 1920s, and the many interviews which were collected together from surviving veterans of the war and those with experiences at the Etaples base camp. For those who wish to read more about this subject, there's also available a number, although a small number, of published memoirs of certain officers and soldiers. And if anybody's really keen afterwards, I can give you the names of some of those books. These works were not undertaken by communists, they're a product of their time, and many of the books which were written about mutinies in British armed forces are written by men who are in no short measure contemptuous of the working class, the soldiering ranks, and hateful towards mutineers and those who might hold them up as heroes. Perhaps the most contentious issue which surrounds the Etaples Mutiny is the ongoing disagreement and rubbishing of the book written by William Addison and John Fairley, entitled The Monocled Mutineer. That's that book. And this book's been subject to severe criticism, especially since it was dramatised for the BBC in the 1980s, and it caused some furore amongst Tories in those times, who used that drama to make accusations of BBC left-wing bias. I don't think anyone can make those accusations these days, but that's certainly what they did in the 1980s. The BBC drama was kept from repeats after its initial airings, and it received a DVD release only in 2012. Whatever the factual limitations of the Monocled Mutineer, the television show, and its paper version, it's well worth noting that even today, when it's 97 years after the events at Etaples, the names of those heroes who were shot, those who we know were shot, and it's been confirmed that they were shot after court-martial, their names are still to be released. In addition to these missing names are the names of any of the ringleaders or other persons who were referred to by the highest echelons of the British military establishment, men who may have been singled out by the investigation, which was carried out by the British Secret Services immediately following the uprising. On October the 3rd, 1917, which was about a month after the events, Field Marshal Douglas Haig wrote a letter to Lord Derby in which he gave his assessment of those men who had caused so much trouble for his planned Passchendaele bloodbath, and shown that the British working class, like any other, is capable of mutiny, insurrection and heroism. This is what he had to say. He said, "Men of this stamp are not satisfied with remaining quiet. They come from a class which like to air real or fancied grievances, and their teaching in this respect is a regrettable antidote to the spirit of devotion and duty of earlier troops." The records of the investigations which were carried out by military authorities as well as the British Secret Services after the mutiny have never been found, and a number of documents appear to have disappeared. In 1978, the British government actually claimed that many had been destroyed in a fire. Don't you hate it when that happens? The remaining papers which are held by the British authorities are locked down until 2017. In this context, we can have no issue with Alison and Fairley's book on supposed factual grounds, as it stands up to scrutiny as well as any account of those events, even though subsequent researchers have not had access to the original papers and interviews. It's also beyond dispute that Alison and Fairley actually did speak to and interview those men who gave them their stories, and indeed a number appeared on radio and television with them in the late 70s and 80s. The historians and military aficionados who seek so desperately to undermine, dismiss and rubbish the events at Etaples, or indeed the actions of Percy Topless or men like him, have no physical material evidence of their own upon which to base their criticism, and it's unlikely that any future government will ever let the truth about Etaples come out in much the same way as the government of the time did everything it could to hush it up 97 years ago. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, as it was known, numbered 2 million men. This was the name given to the British Army in France during the First World War. That force remains the largest army ever assembled and sent abroad by Britain. It ran all along the front with Germany and encompassed many hundreds of thousands of men in the rear. And in the rear, that is where they supplied and maintained what were known as lines of communication, LOCs. And these lines of communication stretched all the way back to Britain. They were responsible for supplying the front with everything it might need. And as such, they supplied food, and they stretched across road, rail and canal transport, supplied vehicles, fuel, maintenance, equipment and supplies of all kinds, including medical attention. And behind the front line and across the lines of communication were various large transport depots. And the British occupied and ran French ports with enslaved colonial labour and men drawn from British industry. In these places, amongst the 300,000 men who worked these networks were French citizens, soldiers coming to and from leave, officers hiding from the front and having what was known as a good war in the French cafes, casinos and brothels, and a mass of new recruits which were being brought over from Britain for deployment and near certain death or injury on the battlefield. In the rear, many of these men roamed as deserters. Thousands were absent without permission. Many hundreds escaped back to England as stowaways on boats, and others lived in the dunes and caves along the coast, constantly hounded and chased by military police. The much maligned Percy Topless was one of these deserters who lived in the woods and fraternised with German and French deserters himself. He had served with the medical corps and suffered at the front lines with the rest, but like many of his contemporaries, he came to prefer life as an outlaw to life in the trenches. The town of Etaples is situated near the French coast, and it was the major base camp through which all the new drafts or recruits for the BEF passed. It encompassed thousands of men who lived in tents and wooden huts, and the vast encampment grew up around the town itself. In addition to the mass of British soldiers were the colonial troops. Anzacs and New Zealanders in particular were there in large numbers, and a large series of hospitals housed men injured at the front. Once these injured men were deemed fit, they were put into the camp for an intensive 10 days training, and this camp where they were trained became known as the Bull Ring, and once completed were duly dispatched back to the front. There are plenty of first-hand accounts of what life at the base camp and in the Bull Ring was like. and I give you a quote. At Etaples, the troops met with conditions which most remember as oppressive. Not even the most experienced or battle-weary were given respite from the war. At the Bullring, as the training grounds were called, soldiers barely discharged from hospital and men who had seen much service in the trenches were put through the same training as the latest drafts from England. A course in gas warfare and 10 days at the Bullring was the usual programme. 10 days, that is, of march and double march across the dunes, supervised by officers and NCOs from the Blood and Bayonet School. An officer remembers the training at Etaples to have been demoralising beyond measure. Another man, newly arriving at Etaples, found the Bullring to be like passing through hell for 2 weeks. A corporal encountered several men returning to the front with wounds which were far from healed. When he asked why they were returning in that condition, they invariably replied, to get away from the Bullring. Even the famous World War I poet, Wilfred Owen, an officer and as such a man entitled to a relatively privileged lifestyle at Etaples when compared to the rank and file, wrote in terrible terms about his time there. He said, "I lay awake in a windy tent in the middle of a vast, dreadful encampment. It seemed neither France nor England, but a kind of paddock where the beasts were kept a few days before the shambles. I heard the revelling of the Scotch troops, who are now dead and who knew they would be dead. I thought of the very strange look on all the faces in the camp, an incomprehensible look which a man will never see in England, nor can it be seen in any battle, but only in Etaples. It was not despair or terror, it was more terrible than terror, for it was a blindfold look and without expression, like a dead rabbit." Officers like Owen were fortunate enough to have their own private tents, servants on hand, and all manner of small but important privileges which were denied to the ordinary soldiers. Not least, officers were allowed to freely enter Etaples town, visit the cafes, casinos, bars and brothels in their time off. On every route into the town, guards were positioned and roadblocks in place to prevent privates and lesser men from enjoying any of these pleasures. In addition to this, soldiers were not even allowed access to the beach to swim and bathe on their days off. To enforce this rigid system, there was a large number of military police, and these men were known as Red Caps. By all accounts, they were hated as intensely, if not more so, than the enemy. When the Etaples Mutiny broke out, the Red Caps were some of the first recipients of the soldiers' quick justice. The only men hated as much, if not more, than them at the camp were known as Canaries. This was because of the yellow armbands they wore. These Canaries were the sadists who ran the Bullring training camp, who also enjoyed privileges denied the troops, and they earned the undying hatred of nearly every man who wrote a memoir about his time passing through the camp. "Even now, in my 80th year," writes Private Notley, "I remember the abuse heaped on the rank and file there, and wonder what comradeship means. The Bullring itself was merely a set of staked out patches in the sandhills. It was tailor-made to compound the torments of the instructors. In the heat of the summer, high collars had to stay tightly buttoned, sleeves immaculately rolled down. The soft sand dragged at the ankles. Wet, it stained the khaki of the uniforms to the fury of the Canaries. Dry, it penetrated collar and cuff to rasp the flesh red against the coarse serge. The sand exacerbated everything. In the frightening dark of a gas chamber, where the crew gas masks were tested, there was sand to drag the feet so that escape seemed as remote as in a nightmare." Private David Patton of Dundee remembers this as the worst of all trials at the Bullring. He said, "You thought you would collapse and choke forever in that deep sand. If you took too long, the Canaries were there to swear and send you through again." Said Private Joe Perks of Dundee, "They had a fence at the Bullring, and often there would be rows of men tied to it, no matter what the weather." It may seem shocking to us today, but a terrifying system of field punishment was used to keep discipline in the British Army. And Field Punishment Number 1, as it was known, described above by Private Perks, was a common ritual. A World War I author and researcher, Chris Baker, has produced a good online guide to field punishment. According to Rule Book, Field Punishment Number 1 consisted of the convicted man being shackled in irons and secured to a fixed object, often a gun wheel or similar. he could be only thus fixed for up to 2 hours in 24 and not for more than 3 days in 4, or for more than 21 days in sentence. This punishment was often known as crucifixion, and due to its humiliating nature was viewed by many Tommies as unfair. Field punishment number 2 was similar, except the man was shackled but not fixed. Of course, anecdotal evidence suggests that this cruel form of punishment was rather freely used to discipline troops for hours on end, and appears from the evidence of men who were there to have been resorted to frequently by the bigwigs in charge of Etaples base camp. When field punishment number 1 or 2 were insufficient, men could be locked up and detained in large jails, which existed not only at Etaples, but at many of the base camps and behind the lines. These jails also housed many men whose sentence of death in court-martial had been commuted to terms of imprisonment. The sentence of death could be given for quite a few reasons, but here's a few of them. Sleeping at your post, casting away arms in the presence of the enemy, showing cowardice in front of the enemy, or striking a superior officer. In addition to these were other offences, including mutiny. The offences concerning mutiny read as so: causing a mutiny in the forces or endeavouring to persuade persons in HM forces to join in a mutiny, or disobeying in such a manner as to show a wilful defiance of authority, a lawful command given personally by a superior officer. The official figures are all we have to go on. How many men were murdered, done to death and dispatched without the proper records will never be known. In addition to this, British imperialism has a long and distinguished record of covering over and hiding from public view the most outrageous acts of cruelty and murder, even those perpetrated against its own. Even so, the official figures record 5,952 officers and 298,310 other ranks were court-martialed. The court-martial was the procedure for dispensing military justice, and of those tried, 89% were convicted. 8% acquitted, the rest either being convicted without the conviction being confirmed, or with it being subsequently quashed. Of those convicted, 30% were for absence without leave, 15% for drunkenness, 14% for desertion, 11% for insubordination, 11% for loss of army property, and the remaining 19% for various other crimes. The main punishments applied were 3 months detention in a military compound, field punishment number 1, fines, 6 months detention, reduction in rank, field punishment number 2. Just over 1% of those convicted were sentenced to death. Of these, 89% were reprieved and the sentence converted to a different one. 346 men, according to official figures, were executed. Their crimes included desertion, murder, cowardice in the face of the enemy, quitting their post, striking or showing violence to their superiors, disobedience and mutiny. One of the many testimonies which the bourgeois hacks like to dismiss in the book by Allison and Fairley is that of a man named Victor Sylvester. In the years after the war, Victor Sylvester became a well-known performer on the London stage. But later on in his life, he went on radio with William Allison about his time at Etaples, and on the radio held back a chapter from his statement which he found too horrifying to tell in his lifetime. He left this in his will, and it was released after his death, and Allison included it in his book. In it, Sylvester recalls carrying out executions at Etaples as punishment for being caught by his superiors reading the lists of those to be shot. These lists hung on the wall in the headquarters. To punish him for reading these lists, he was ordered to carry out 5 executions, but his nerve broke and he was committed to hospital. This is what he said in his testament. The first man I had to help to kill was a private in my own regiment, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, a fact which filled me with even greater shame. He was said to have fled in the face of the enemy. We marched to a quarry outside Etaples at first dawn, and the victim was brought out from a shed and led struggling to a chair, to which he was then bound and a white handkerchief placed over his heart as our target area. Mortified at the sight of the poor wretch tugging at his bonds, 12 of us, on the order, raised our rifles unsteadily. Some of the men, unable to face their ordeal, had got themselves drunk overnight. They could not have aimed straight if they tried, and contrary to popular belief, all 12 rifles were loaded. The condemned man had also been plied with whisky during the night, but he remained sober through fear. The tears were rolling down my cheeks as he went on attempting to free himself from the ropes which attached him to the chair. I aimed blindly, and when the gun smoke had cleared away, we were further horrified to see that, although wounded, the intended victim was still alive. Still blindfolded, he was attempting to make a run for it, still strapped to his chair. The blood was running freely from a chest wound. An officer in charge stepped forward to put the finishing touch with a revolver held to the poor man's temple. He had only cried out once, and that was when he shouted the one word, "Mother." He could not have been very much older than me. At the time of the execution, Sylvester was 17. The mutiny at Etaples began, as these things tend to, with a single spark, although various versions of the events persist. On Sunday the 9th of September, men were gathered outdoors in the sunshine. Some were pleading with guards at the various checkpoints to be allowed into Etaples town, others were milling about the camp. At 3 in the afternoon, it's recalled that the military police arrested unjustly Gunner A.J. Healy, who after a routine bout of police justice in the prison cell was released from custody the worse for wear. Angered by the ease with which the military police were able to brutalise the soldiers, a series of demonstrations were called by the rank and file, and in one particular case a scuffle broke out. In the ensuing melee, a policeman named Private Reeve drew a revolver and managed to kill a corporal from the Gorland Highlanders and a girl he was said to be talking with. I'll give you a quote now from somebody who was there. The shooting incensed the crowd, whose wrath was concentrated on the military police. They withdrew from their hut, and when the officer responsible for them, Captain Strachan, the assistant provost marshal, rode up, he was stoned. Another officer, the adjutant, Captain Guinness, also came to see what was happening and realised that the police had lost all control. He reported to Colonel Nason, the officer in charge of reinforcements, who immediately ordered a picket to be collected. One officer and 25 men with rifles and bayonets were sent to the bridge. Nason went too, and seeing the serious state of affairs, called up 2 further pickets of over 100 men from 3 other base depots. The camp adjutant, Captain Guinness, later became Major Guinness, and in his dotage he wrote his memoirs. These were called Notes on the Mutiny, and he said, "Word of the incident went round to all the depots, and that night the men poured into the town and refused to obey orders. One of the staff captains at the office of the officer in charge for reinforcements, a very brave man, stood on the parapet of the bridge with a drop of 40 foot below him and started to harangue the men, but they disregarded him. Before this, he attempted to stop the men crossing the bridge by lining up a lot of officers from the camp about 6 deep, and the men swept them aside. They swarmed into town, raided the office of the base commandant, pulled him out of his chair and carried him on their shoulders through the town." One account of this first night of rioting actually maintains that the commandant and his officers were paraded before the troops before being thrown over the bridge into the river. One of those who took part in the rush on the commandant's office was Frank Reynolds of Leicester. He was a founder member of the Old Comrades Association, which later became the British Legion. He said, "The commandant was regarded as the lowest form of human existence, a craven coward, and it was generally known he was a heavy drinker without a thought for the suffering in his own self-made concentration camp." In Alison Fairley's account of the story on the first night, it continues, "A group of 100 mutineers had crashed into the midst of an officers' meeting, and they summarily ordered them to their feet. We were armed, but we did not require to use our weapons. The officers meekly obeyed. We bundled them outside and locked them up in the guard room. We then piled brushwood and trestles against the wooden hut. It was a succinct ultimatum. half an hour to give an undertaking to improve the soldier's lot or be burned alive. It took less than 10 minutes for an officer to call out a surrender on the terms stated. As Reynolds put it, like the cowards they were, they quickly capitulated. Despite all contrary evidence, the camp diary, which was kept at the base by the Commandant Brigadier Thompson, dismissed the events of that first day of mutiny, and he recorded that all the men were back in camp and tucked up by nightfall. Of course, much of what is recorded in that diary, one of the few official accounts to have survived, is quite clearly an attempt to play down and dismiss the serious disorder which began on the Sunday and lasted until Friday. Disorder which was to effectively see Brigadier Thompson removed from his position at Etaples and banished to a lesser posting. In an article in The Guardian, William Allison later commented that the Commandant's diary had attempted to make the entire week-long mutiny sound like one very long, rowdy soccer match. Vera Britton, who was a nurse at the camp and later wrote a famous autobiography called Testament of Youth, recalled this rowdy soccer match. She said, "Quite who was against whom I never clearly gathered, but one party was said to be holding the bridge over the Canch, which is a river. Obviously the village was no place for females, so for over a fortnight we were shut up within our hospitals. As though the ceaseless convoys did not provide us with sufficient occupation, numerous drunken and dilapidated warriors from the village battle were sent to such spare beds as we had for slight repairs. They were euphemistically referred to as local sick." Vera might not have known what all the fuss about, but she probably didn't subscribe to the left-wing press of the day. A letter, which is pretty much the only known letter that evaded the censors at the time and was published in Sylvia Pankhurst's Workers' Dreadnought. It was from a British soldier and it read, "About 10,000 men had a big racket at Etaples and cleared the whole place from one end to the other. And when the general asked what was wrong, they said they wanted the war stopped." On the Monday morning, the unrest had become serious enough to bring two bigwigs down to the camp in the shape of Lieutenant General Asser from the command and Major Dugdale, who was a senior policeman from General Headquarters. With the top brass came 100 men from the Lewis Gun School, who strung out along the coast as far as a place known as Paris Plague, to protect the bourgeois dining rooms and casinos. Throughout the day, a sizable number of riotous troops remained in Etaples town centre. There they held meetings and did all those things denied to them which hungry men do so well. They began to be joined by others from across the camp, and a sizable number moved to the far side of the town towards Paris Plague and gathered at the bridge over the River Canch. On one of the bridges, a picket of British and Canadian soldiers under a captain confronted a band of 70 or 80 men who were marching from the camp towards the town. Some were carrying red flags and wrenched up notice boards. One of the mutineers called upon the picket guard to join the mutiny. He said, "Don't listen to the bloody officer. What you want to do is tie a rope around his neck with a stone attached to it and throw him in the river." The speaker was a 30-year-old corporal from a northern regiment. He was charged with mutiny, found guilty, sentenced to death and executed 3 weeks later. But before this particular man, and no doubt many others, was caught and later sentenced to execution, it seems as though a number of meetings were held in the town at which the troops planned the way forward and formulated their demands. No documentary evidence of these proceedings exist, and why on earth would they? But recollections of those who took part state that a committee was elected to present the demands of the men. Many of the bourgeois scholars either deny that there was any formal organisation of the mutiny, or maintain that in the absence of what Allison once wryly described as the dry meat of official records, there was no proof of any organisation. But in writing their book, Allison and Fairley managed to speak to a number of men who actually took part in those days and gave a very different account. Here's a quote from one of them. "Those officers who had maintained control of the troops in their own base depot compound now attempted to march them out for the usual training in the bullring. Private Phil Chester of the Northumberland Fusiliers, living at 2 Crane Close, Cranwell, Sleaford, Lincolnshire, after retiring from 30 years working at the nearby RAF college, said, "The moment you got to the bullring, the routine was you fell out and sat on the sand until the instructors came. That particular morning when they told us to get up, nobody moved. We just kept sitting. It was truly an amazing sight to look around and see thousands and thousands of men just sitting there silently. There were sergeant majors, corporals and instructors by the hundreds, all shouting at us to get to our feet. Not a man moved. In the end, they got us up by promising we could go back to camp and have a day's rest. Back at the camp, the sit-down troops were given a meal, and when they finished eating, they were asked, 'Is there any complaints?' Phil Chester and his mates were so astonished that they celebrated by bursting through the railway bridge pickets into Etaples town. The mutineers, who had not returned to the base on the Sunday, had instinctively made their way to link up with the permanent deserters who flourished in the woods around Paris Plague, most of them under the patronage and guidance of Percy Topless. Mr. William Stevens of Helsinki Road, Wandsworth, London, a Ministry of Social Security official, a school governor and Battersea Trades Council vice president before his retirement, was at Paris Plague when the mutineers and the deserters joined forces on the Monday. He remembers seeing Topless's name on the wanted posters in the area. He said, "If he was a villain, then he was not the only one around Etaples. Maybe he too was tired of being humiliated, deprived, brutalised and treated like a dog. We had all got tired of being treated with less consideration than that which was given to the horses." It was a strange council of war which convened on the Monday morning. The clear-headed Topless, fresh from an overnight stay in the Hotel de Anglais, where he had posed as an officer just back from the line on leave, had to do most of the thinking. The delight of the deserters was boundless when they heard that the military police were no more. They were eager to show their gratitude and, assured that the coast had been quite literally cleared, they offered to return to Etaples with the mutineers to take part in day 2 of the mutiny. This weird mixed bag of disaffection and desertion marched on Etaples in the late afternoon. They were about 1,000 strong and they swung along the coast road. Before they got to the Canche Bridge, they merged and split into 4 separate groups, each numbering over 200. Topless felt he had a clear duty. He headed his men straight for the detention compound and released prisoners, about 50. A local woman, Madame André Dessous of Etaples, remembered seeing 200 or so men just march up to the compound gates, issue some threats, and the next thing the prisoners, with their shaven heads, came tumbling through the gates. It's reported that the situation deteriorated and Commandant Thompson began a tour of the camp, haranguing the men to fall back into line. His car was forced to stop at a roadblock which had been set up by Topless and his men. Thompson stood up in the back only to have his opening sentence drowned in a storm of abuse. He got as far as, "How dare you call yourselves soldiers, British soldiers?" When the mob closed in on the vehicle and started to rock it violently, he was forced to sit down. Topless had dressed for his part. That is to say, this was one of the few occasions when he was actually attired in a private's uniform and not that of an officer. He held up his hand, signalling for silence. What a sight it was to see the commanding officer there with tears in his eyes, begging us to let this trouble subside, recalls a Lancashire Fusilier, George Souter of Ardwick, and appealing for us to keep up the traditions of the British Army. The sight of the ashen-faced general, sitting now in the back seat, encouraged Topless to climb on the running boards and dictate the terms for the ending of the mutiny. The revolt would end, he told Thompson, only when the town of Etaples was thrown open to the troops, when the bullring had been closed and military police removed, when food and general conditions improved. Another group from the New Zealand Rifle Brigade put similar demands to Thompson on the Monday. But for the moment the commandant wouldn't budge. When Thompson rose on the Tuesday, he set about bringing into Etaples sufficient forces to quell the uprising. He immediately put in a request for the 9th Cavalry, but this was eventually refused. His diary records it as a misunderstanding, but Thompson must have felt hung out to dry. It's quite probable that the superiors were fearful of inflaming the situation and concerned about the effect of withdrawing troops from the front, particularly with the offensive at Passchendaele, so long planned by Haig due to begin just 8 days later. Thompson's camp diary reads, "At 1:30 p.m, 9th Cavalry Brigade were rung. No answer could be given. 2 p.m, Staff Captain Wells motored over to Ferenc and told the OC 15th Hussars what duties would be required from them in the event of the authority being given for their use. 4 p.m, a message telephone was received to say GHQ would not authorise use of cavalry. About 4 p.m, the men again broke through the pickets over the bridge, went to Etaples, broke through the picket on the River Canch, went towards Paris Plague. None of the pickets made any determined effort to prevent the men. By the Tuesday evening, faced with the refusal of the General Headquarters not to use the cavalry and the ongoing problems controlling the bridges and pickets, Thompson was forced to concede the demands of the troops, and he allowed free entry to and from Etaples. In the days that followed, order was gradually but slowly restored, and troops arrived in the camp and town to take up the positions vacated by the military police, who had either been killed by the rioting troops or had run away. The police commander Strachan, who himself was removed. On Wednesday, with disturbances continuing and angered by the impunity with which orders were continuing to be disobeyed and flouted, Lieutenant General Asser made a return visit, and he gave final sanction to the calling up of 400 men of the Honourable Artillery Company, composed of many, or mostly, public school boys and such reliable men. Robert Grave, who some of you might recognise his name, he was the author of a book called Goodbye to All That. He served with that battalion, and he was happy to tell Bertrand Russell many years later that his battalion would have been happy to fire on striking munition workers, referring here to men such as the communists Willie Gallagher and Arthur McManus, who so bravely led Red Clydeside in exactly such action during World War I. In addition to these troops, the 15th Hussars were ordered into position and one section of a machine gun squadron. Over the Thursday and Friday, the number of battles and disturbances slowly diminished, largely due to more than 10,000 troops being hurriedly moved out of Etaples and sent up to the front line in preparation for the Passchendaele offensive. Amongst their number were many of the mutineers. Passchendaele was to serve as a mass execution for the mutineers from Etaples. For those left, and for the new arrivals into the camp who continued to come from the draft in Britain, conditions were, by the Saturday, very different from the week before. The men were allowed the freedom of the town, and bathing in the sea was permitted. In the weeks ahead, the Bullring training ground was closed for good and never reopened in the rest of the war. All of these can be considered as sensible moves from a ruling class well schooled in dissipating unrest and putting retribution off for a later date. As these reforms were being carried out publicly, the lust for vengeance on the part of the officer class and establishment was well underway behind the scenes. A Secret Service agent, Edwin Woodhall, who later wrote up parts of his story, was sent to Etaples to undertake an investigation along with the military and the police. All these reports, and those of the Board of Inquiry that was set up, have never been found. Woodhall, in his memoirs, relates how he spent the weeks that followed rounding up deserters and on the trail of Percy Topless, whom he managed to capture some weeks later. Unfortunately for Woodhall, Topless was able to escape from his imprisonment, and he eventually made his way back to England, where he re-enlisted in both the Army and the RAF. Unfortunately, he was eventually caught up with following a police nationwide manhunt, and sadly Percy Topless met a violent end. He was framed for a murder in England, being the first man in English history to be found guilty in his absence by a coroner's court, and police eventually caught up with him in Penrith, where he was shot down in the street by plainclothes policemen, whence he was taken to the coroner, where his tongue was cut out, just for good measure. The inquest into his death was swift, and the officers involved in his execution were later given awards for their bravery, and then subsequently all of them were retired a matter of months later. The inquest delivered a verdict of justifiable homicide, and Topless was hurriedly buried in an unmarked grave in Penrith Cemetery. Some of his possessions, including his monocle, which he used to cut a dash when impersonating officers, are still on display to this day in Penrith Museum. Despite the reforms undertaken at the Etaples base camp, a number of other smaller uprisings and mutinies continued to take place. Some were brutally put down and others were more sedate, but persisted well into the period of demobilisation. The story of Etaples and the disturbances which followed exposed the myth of an army happily carrying out its duty for king and country. Yes, there was no revolutionary direction given in these struggles, but how could there have been? The British working class at that time had no revolutionary organisation. The Communist Party did not come into being until 1920, by which point the opportunity was lost. In Russia, it had been very different. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had built up a revolutionary organisation over many years before and were able to direct the strikes, mutinous actions and fraternisation behind Russian lines into revolutionary struggle, eventually culminating in the Great October Socialist Revolution. A particularly gruesome battle, which took place a matter of weeks after Etaples, involved a number of Chinese and colonial labourers. In reality, these individuals were slave labour, and they were brought in from across the British Empire. They rioted against their conditions, and the British authorities moved swiftly to deal with them. A Corporal Harry Rogers from Birmingham was one of the soldiers at Boulogne ordered to kill those foul foreigners. He said, "It was a wretched, pitiful business. The poor bastards had been little more than slaves, earning 1 penny a day compared to our shilling a day, which had been bad enough. They were nearly all illiterate, without the slightest notion of why they were slaving 18 hours a day in order that one alien country might knock hell out of another. Our officers instructed us not to accord them even the dignity of rebels. We were under strict instruction to look upon them as pure rabble. If they showed face in the street in groups of over 3 in number, they were to be shot like rabid dogs, and they were, mainly because a feature of the massacre was the clear understanding that if we didn't obey our orders, we too would be shot." We had heard what was going on at Etaples, and as we took up firing positions in groups of 20 on street corners, we couldn't help wondering if this was what was being meted out to our comrades just down the coast. A Glasgow private who took part in one of the massacres of Chinese labourers who had stormed an expensive bourgeois cafe called Moni's recalls, "By the time we arrived, the mob was already overturning staff cars outside the restaurant. Inside, officers had overturned marble tabletops and were cowering and crouching behind them on their hands and knees. It was not an ennobling sight, and neither was what followed. 90 of us opened fire as ordered, and the foreigners, who had not even got as far as the door, fell dead in the gutter. How many, I don't know. I was too appalled to look. I just wanted to get away as soon as possible." Even today, all those years later, I'm too ashamed to dwell on the awful details of that massacre. Looking back on it, the only slight satisfaction I get is the many stray bullets accidentally smashing through the restaurant window. The officers inside had far more to fear from their own armed men than they had from the rabble. In this we learn another lesson from the failure of the British working class, which lacked revolutionary leadership, a failure to not make common cause with the colonial oppressed peoples. It was not until the formation of the Communist Party of Great Britain, with the assistance of the Third International, that serious organised attempts were made to link up the struggles of the British proletarian with those of the colonial people. The Etaples Mutiny took place in time of severe hardship for the men sent to do the bidding of the imperialist class. In February, the revolution in Russia had shaken the Allied forces, and many hundreds of thousands of Russian troops took strike action and began to distribute the revolutionary proclamations of the Bolsheviks, who were openly agitating behind and in the Russian front line for the defeat of their own government and the end of the war. Sadly, with a few honourable exceptions, the British labour movement was not led by men of the Bolshevik type. Rather, our leading trade unionists and Labour members of Parliament had fallen in with and were actively advocating the defence of the fatherland, along with the rest of the parties of the Second International and the bourgeoisie with whom they were united. They had betrayed the international working class. A number of journals did begin to circulate amongst British troops, the Labour leader and Herald in particular, and it would be likely that men returning from leave did distribute copies of the Workers' Dreadnought and other more radical newspapers. However, the newspapers of the parties of the Second International, and to a great extent those of the Pankhurst and others, were incapable of demonstrating to the British workers and troops the way out of the crisis. Only for a firm struggle against opportunism within the British Labour movement would it have been possible to take the revolutionary road towards a socialist revolution. In the words of Lenin, social chauvinism is advocacy of the idea of defence of the fatherland in the present war. Further, this idea logically leads to the abandonment of class struggle during the war, to voting war credits, etc. Actually, the social chauvinists are pursuing an anti-proletarian bourgeois policy. For actually, they are championing not the defence of the fatherland in the sense of fighting foreign oppression, but the right of one or other of the great powers to plunder colonies and to oppress other nations. The social chauvinists repeat the bourgeois deception of the people that the war is being waged to protect the freedom and existence of nations, and thereby they go over to the side of the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. In the category of social chauvinists are those who justify and embellish the governments and bourgeoisie of one of the belligerent groups of powers, as well as those who, like Kautsky, argue that the socialists of all the belligerent powers have an equal right to defend the fatherland. Social chauvinism being actually defence of the privileges, advantages, robbery and violence of one's own imperialist bourgeoisie is the utter betrayal of all socialist convictions. Opportunism and social chauvinism have the same ideological political content. Collaboration of classes instead of class struggle. Renunciation of revolutionary methods of struggle, helping one's own government in its embarrassed situation instead of taking advantage of these embarrassments for revolution. If we take all the European countries as a whole, if we pay attention not to individuals, even the most authoritative, we will find that it is the opportunist trend that has become the chief bulwark of social chauvinism. The bourgeois newspapers of all the belligerent countries have reported cases of fraternisation between the soldiers of the belligerent nations, even in the trenches. And the issue by the military authorities of Germany and England of draconic orders against such fraternisation proved that the governments and the bourgeoisie attached grave importance to it. The fact that such cases of fraternisation have been possible, even when opportunism reigns supreme in the top ranks of the social democratic parties of Western Europe, and when social chauvinism is supported by the entire social democratic press and by all the authorities of the Second International, shows us how possible it would be to shorten the present criminal, reactionary and slave owners' war, and to organise a revolutionary international movement if systematic work were conducted in this direction, if only by the left-wing socialists in all the belligerent countries. Both the advocates of victory for their governments in the present war and the advocates of the slogan "neither victory nor defeat" equally take the standpoint of social chauvinism. A revolutionary class cannot but wish for the defeat of its government in a reactionary war. It cannot fail to see that its military reverses facilitate its overthrow. Only a bourgeois who believes that a war started by the governments must necessarily end as a war between governments, and wants it to end as such, can regard as ridiculous and absurd the idea that the socialists of all belligerent countries should wish for the defeat of their governments and express this wish. On the contrary, it's precisely a statement of this kind that would conform to the cherished thoughts of every class-conscious worker, and would be in line with our activities towards converting the imperialist war into civil war. Undoubtedly, the serious anti-war agitation that is being conducted by a section of the British, German and Russian socialists has weakened the military power of their respective governments. But such agitation stands to the credit of the socialists. Socialists must explain to the masses that they have no other road of salvation except the revolutionary overthrow of their government, and that advantage must be taken of these governments' embarrassments in the present war precisely for this purpose. Comrades, we must learn the mistakes from our own history if we're not to be doomed to make the same mistakes. British imperialism is doing everything it can to whip up inside our country a jingoism to accompany their aggressive manoeuvring, especially with regards to Russia and China. We have yet to see exactly how the forces of international capital will line up, and in which situation we may find ourselves confronted with a third inter-imperialist world war. But we must be clear that it's the job of communists and revolutionaries to turn the inevitable riots, mutinies and uprisings into riots, mutinies and uprisings against capitalism, to lend them a consciousness and to turn the future imperialist war into a civil war here at home. That means we must wage a determined struggle against opportunism in the labour movement, against the role of the Social Democrats and Trotskyites, against those who continually find new ways to put a left spin on siding with imperialism in its wars of aggression, be they aimed at Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, or even a future war with Russia. And I'm going to end with a quote from Lenin, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which says, "The fight against imperialism is a sham and a fraud unless it is inseparably bound up with the fight against opportunism."
Ignorance is venomous and it murders the soul, spreading like a virus, running rampant out of control. So if I should ever fall and get caught in a hustle, let them know that I died while I fought in the struggle. From the hood rats to rich kids lost in the bubbles, spray painted on the streets and in the subway tunnels. Write it down and remember that we never gave in. The mind of a child is where the revolution begins. So if the solution has never been to look at yourself, how is it that you expect to find it anywhere else?